Jonas.
Dust hung low over the mountain road like tired smoke when Jonas Hale rode into Grady's crossing. He tied his mule to the hitching rail without a word, shoulders squared against the morning chill, hat brim tilted to keep the wind from reading his eyes. Men on the boardwalk glanced up and then away. There were stories about Jonas, the kind that made a saloon go quiet. Once he'd had a wife, a stretch of good pasture, and a house with a porch that sang in the breeze. Then came the emptiness that settled between two people when a cradle stays quiet year after year. One night she left a note on the table and her ring beside it. After that, Jonas learned to live with the sound of nothing. The orphanage at the edge of town wasn't much. Warped siding, a roof patched with tin, a yard fenced by rails too splintered to keep a dog from dreaming. Inside, the smell was boiled starch and wood ash. Miss Temperance, the head mistress, wore a shawl that might have been white a winter ago. She studied Jonas the way a judge studies a man's boots, looking for the places the world had been unkind. "You here to donate?" she asked. "In a manner," Jonas said. He reached into his coat, set down $3 silver. The coins made a small, sharp sound on the desk. "I'm taking 3. A chair scraped behind him. 2 men from the livery had followed him in, curiosity hitching a ride on their boots. Miss Temperance's mouth pinched. "This isn't a cattle auction, Mr. Hale." "I ain't haggling." Jonas's voice never rose. "You're feeding too many mouths with not enough spoons. I've got room and work." The headmistress hesitated. Out back, a door creaked, and 3 children filed into the office as if called by the quiet. A girl with a rag doll missing an eye. A tall boy whose knuckles were scabbed from defending something that was never his. And the smallest, pale as morning milk, eyes fixed on Jonas like he recognized a tune he couldn't place. Miss Temperance tapped the coins with one finger. "Why 3? Jonas weighed his answer. Truth was, he'd woken before dawn with the dry certainty of a man making a promise to himself. If he couldn't build a family the way God intended, he'd build one out of what the world forgot. But he didn't say that. "Because $3 is what I brought." The livery hand snorted. "Hale's gone soft," one mumbled. The other, mean with boredom, added, "We're looking for cheap help." Jonas turned his head just enough that the men saw the cut in his cheekbone that never quite healed right. They found the door in a hurry. Papers were signed slow, as if the ink had weight. Miss Temperance asked questions. Food, schooling, church on Sundays. Jonas answered with short, straight lines. He didn't promise more than he could carry. The tall boy squared his shoulders. "What do we call you?" "Jonas is fine." "We supposed to call you sir?" the girl asked, voice no bigger than her doll's missing eye. "You can if it helps you mind." The smallest child said nothing, just watched. Outside, the wind lifted dust off the road and set it down again. Jonas led the children toward his mule, then stopped. He crouched to the girl, tightened the ribbon on her shawl. "Mountain air bites early. Keep this close." She nodded, relief flickering across her face and disappearing like a candle pinched out. They started for the trail that climbed into the pines, the orphanage shrinking behind them. Jonas felt the drag of eyes from porches and windows. The town is a jury that never adjourns. He set his stride slow so the little legs could keep up. The tall boy walked like he expected the world to shove him and wanted to beat it to the first push. The girl skipped in stutters, unsure whether joy was allowed. Half a mile past the last house, where the telegraph line thinned to one humming wire and the sky turned wide enough to swallow regrets, Jonas broke the silence. "There's chores. You'll learn them. There's rules. You'll follow them. I ain't your father, but I'll see you fed, warm, and safe." The tall boy grunted something that wasn't quite thanks and not quite defiance. Jonas let it pass. Boys cut their manners on the grindstone of the men around them. It took time to set the edge right. They reached a bend where the trail narrowed between 2 shoulders of rock. The mule snorted. Somewhere high, a hawk called once, thin and chastising. Jonas stopped to check the pack cinch, more for an excuse to look at them proper than any need of rope. He saw the hunger that turns faces older than their years. The stiffness in the girl's shoes rubbed raw at the heel. The way the tall boy's eyes flicked to every sound like he was counting exits. And the smallest, those gray ember eyes that acted like they knew him from a longer road. "How old are you, son?" Jonas asked without turning his head. The boy lifted a number of fingers that didn't match the age in his stare. They moved on. The pines took the wind and sifted it, the forest talking in 1,000 small tongues. Needles, cones, bark, all saying, "Keep moving." Jonas measured the distance to his cabin in the muscle of his legs. He told himself he'd bought trouble and the means to beat it back. He told himself the mountains made every man honest sooner or later. At a shallow creek, the girl stumbled, nearly went in. Jonas caught her by the elbow, steady as a fence post. She looked up, searching his face for something. Permission, maybe. He gave her a small nod. She smiled like smiles were something you had to sneak. They drank from the cold water cupped in hands. Jonas refilled his canteen and looked at the smallest boy again. The child stood on a flat stone, boots lined up like he'd been measured to fit the mountain. He was staring straight at Jonas, lips pressed together as if trying to hold a word back before it did damage. "Speak plain if you've got a thing to say," Jonas said, not unkind. The boy's mouth moved. A whisper, almost too thin to carry across the thread of water. But the sound reached Jonas clean as a bell rung once. "Jonas, not sir, not mister." His name, spoken soft, like a secret, returned. The hair on Jonas's forearms lifted beneath the coat. He set the canteen down very carefully. "Who told you that?" The question came out level, but a nail of cold settled under his breastbone. The tall boy frowned, looking from Jonas to the small one. The girl squeezed her doll till the cloth creaked. The smallest didn't blink. "I know it." The creek went on, talking to the stones. Up in the pines, something rustled and then held its breath. Jonas studied the boy's face for the trick of it. Some town prank, a name overheard in the orphanage office, a livery hand with a loose mouth. But the boy's eyes held nothing except the steadiness of someone who'd chosen a word and lived with the choosing. Jonas swallowed the dryness in his throat. "You don't know me." A tiny shake of the head. Not yes, not no. Just that stubborn third answer children have before the world teaches them to choose. They climbed the last rise in silence. The roof line of Jonas's cabin showed itself, low and stubborn among the pines. Smoke rising from the stovepipe he'd banked before dawn. Home, if a man decided to call it that. On the threshold of his clearing, Jonas stopped. He felt the shape of the next days gathering around him. Chores broken into smaller hands, nights where the house made more than one kind of sound, a table where plates touched. He could carry all of it. He'd chosen to. But a question now rode with them, uninvited and heavy. How did the smallest one know his name? Jonas pushed open the gate. "Inside," he said, and his voice was steady again, iron hammered flat. "We'll sort the rest after you've eaten." Behind him, the smallest child stepped over the sill and looked around like he'd been here before. If you're hooked by this mystery, tap like and subscribe to follow the trail up these mountains. Every clue matters. The fire in Jonas Hale's cabin spat and hissed, throwing restless shadows against the pine-planked walls. The three orphans sat around the table, their small frames swallowed by the rough-hewn chairs. Jonas set bread and strips of salted venison before them, the closest thing to welcome he could manage. The tall boy tore into the food like a wolf, suspicion still etched into his face. The girl nibbled polite, eyes darting about as if every creak in the timber might mean she'd be sent away. But the youngest, the pale one with the gray ember stare, merely picked at the crust. Gaze locked on Jonas as though the firelight had carved out a secret only they shared. Jonas poured himself whiskey, trying to wash the dust from his throat, but the burn did nothing against the unease twisting in his gut. He'd lived alone too long to mistake a child's slip of the tongue for nothing. That boy had spoken his name with the weight of memory. At length, Jonas leaned forward, elbows heavy on the table. His voice came low, gravel ground against iron. "Boy, who told you my name?" The cabin fell still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause at the shutter. The girl froze with her bread halfway to her mouth. The tall boy scowled, eyes darting between the two. The pale child lifted his chin, unblinking. His voice was calm, far older than his frame. "You did." Jonas blinked, heat rising in his chest. "No, I never met you before today." The boy didn't flinch. "You met I before." The words landed like stones in a well, echoing into places Jonas had buried deep. His pulse roared in his ears. He thought of Wichita, the tavern thick with smoke, the poker table gone sour, the fight that ended with steel and blood. A man's final gasp, whispering Jonas's name as life slipped away. Jonas gripped his glass until the veins stood out on his hand. He forced his gaze away, but when it fell back, the boy's eyes hadn't moved. They burned steady, reflecting the fire like embers that refused to die. The girl shifted uneasily. The tall boy muttered, "He's crazy, mister. Don't listen." But Jonas couldn't unhear it. He had left a body cooling on a tavern floor years ago, certain the past would stay buried beneath whiskey and wilderness. Yet tonight, in his own cabin, a child spoke as though the past had climbed out of its grave and sat across the table. Jonas's voice cracked low, almost a growl. "What do you want from me?" The boy's lips curved, half a smile, half a warning. "To remember." The fire popped, scattering sparks. Jonas swallowed hard, his throat dry as desert sand. Something in the boy's voice, in the way he said remember, made the room shrink around him. The mountains had taught Jonas many things. How to track in snow, how to gut a deer, how to outlast loneliness. But nothing had prepared him for the echo of a dead man's voice living inside a child. Night took the mountain quick. By the time the dishes were rinsed with creek-cold water and propped to dry along the sill, the world beyond the windows had gone the color of old iron. Jonas set another stick on the fire and listened to the cabin settle. Timbers easing, the roof giving back the day's heat in faint pops. The three children watched him with three different kinds of silence. "Names," Jonas said at last. "I won't shout into a room full of nameless ghosts." The tall boy squared up. "I'm Caleb." It came out like a dare. The girl smoothed her doll's ragged dress. "Maggie," she whispered. Jonas nodded to the smallest, who still hadn't finished his bread. The boy lifted his eyes, steady as a level. "Thomas," he said, and the name felt chosen after a pause, as if he'd tried on others and found this one fit least poorly. "All right," Jonas said. "Rules are simple. You work, you eat, you lie, you answer for it. You run, you best run hard." He pointed a thumb to the back corner. "Pallets, Maggie by the hearth. Caleb, you take the far wall. Thomas, near the door where the draft ain't so mean." Caleb bristled. "Why does he get the warm spot?" "He doesn't," Jonas said. "He gets the door, which I like watched." They unrolled quilts. Maggie arranged her doll the way some folks arrange prayer books. Caleb tested his new territory like a wolf testing a fence, pressing a hand to the wall, knocking once, listening for hollows. Thomas didn't claim space so much as measure it. He drifted to the shelf where Jonas kept a coffee tin, an old horseshoe, a half-used spool of wire. Things a man keeps because they might be useful someday. His fingers hovered, not touching, as if the objects were words in a language he almost remembered. Jonas poured hot water over coffee grounds and let it go bitter. He needed the bite. The boy's earlier words sat in him like a pebble in a boot. Small, relentless, threatening to raise blood if ignored. "You did. You met before. To remember." They landed too close to a night in Wichita he had spent years not thinking about. "Chores at first light," he said. "Fence check, coop, stack kindling. Then we see to the traps. We ride to town Saturdays for flour and salt. If the sky turns wrong, we stay put." He handed each a tin cup of water. "Questions? Maggie, do we go to church?" "When we can," Jonas said. "Caleb, you gonna keep us, no matter what?" Jonas met his stare. "I said I would, didn't I?" Thomas didn't ask anything. He cocked his head toward the door, as if listening for a sound none of them could hear. The draft lifted the hair by his ear. He looked at Jonas then, not with challenge or fear, but with the unsettling plainness of a book that tells you what page you're on. Jonas took a slow drink and set the cup down. "There's a trap door under that rug," he said to Caleb, as if it were an afterthought. "Only holds tools and winter stores. Stays shut unless I say." He let the weight of the warning rest a beat. Caleb nodded, eyes giving away his intention to see for himself anyway. They turned down the lamps. Firelight did the rest, washing the room in low orange. Outside, the wind stropped itself along the pines. Coyotes yipped far off, that thin, hungry chorus that reminded a man how much dark the world owns. Jonas lay on his own cot, boots still on, hat over his eyes. He didn't pretend at sleep. If he shut his eyes, the tavern came back. The sticky plank floor, the lamp smoke, the lurch when a man across the table said good hands can't fix bad luck. He remembered the shove, the flash of a knife, the stupid hot certainty in his own arm. He remembered the alley after, where cold air met hot breath, and a voice that should have been strong turned small and wet, saying Jonas like a prayer without a church left in it. The floorboard 2 planks to his left gave with a soft complaint. "Back to your pallet, Caleb," Jonas said into his hat. "You pull that trap door and I'll know it before you do." Silence, then, Was just checking the draft, the boy muttered. Draft's fine, Jonas said. Sleep. But the cabin kept awake a while longer. You can teach your body to go still. You can't teach your thoughts to heal. Jonas listened to the 3 different breaths settle into their separate rhythms. Maggie's, fluttering like a bird in a hand until at last it slowed. Caleb's, stubbornly awake, then surrendering by inches. Thomas's, quiet and even, as if he were the one house beam that never creaked. When sleep came for Jonas, it came in short lengths, frayed at the ends. He dreamed of snow choking the passes and a small figure ahead of him on the trail that never quite turned its face. Dawn dealt the world back in shades of pewter. Jonas rose to ash the coals and stir them back to life. He opened the door and the cold slapped him honest. The mountain smelled like wet iron and pine pitch. He stepped out, rolled his shoulders, scanned the tree line the way he always did. Left to right, low to high, then back again. Because a man lives longer when his eyes do the same work every morning. Boot, he called us, everybody. Caleb came fast, lacing while he walked. Maggie tucked her doll into the quilt like a promise she'd come back. Thomas reached the door last, and when he crossed the threshold, he paused on the sill, eyes flicking. Not at the trees, not at the sky, but at the ground by the woodpile where snow never settled because something had been there in the night. A shape in the duff, faint but readable. A boot print too narrow for Jonas, too long to be a child's, the heel worn slanted, the way a man leans on one side after an old break. Jonas saw at the same time Thomas did. He didn't speak. He just let his gaze travel to the fence gate. It hung the way he'd left it, bar down, peg through. But the peg showed a shine it hadn't had yesterday, like it had been worked in and out and in again by a hand that couldn't decide. Caleb followed their eyes. Someone out there? Could be a drifter, Jonas said, and the words felt too light. He squatted, pressed 2 fingers to the print, gauged the depth, the hours. Late night, before the wind shifted. Weight of a man who didn't hurry. He stood. We keep to the chores. Maggie, coop eggs. Caleb, kindling. Thomas, door, the boy said softly. You like it watched. That earned him a look Jonas hadn't planned to give. Something between respect and worry. Door it is, he said. If anyone hollers, you holler twice as loud. They moved. Work steadies terror the way a bridle steadies a horse. Jonas split logs, each strike clean, measured. Caleb stacked, rough but willing. Maggie counted eggs, whispering numbers to keep the count from tangling. Thomas sat on the stool by the jam, small hands wrapped around the latch, eyes roaming the line where the pines begin. The sun shouldered higher, taking some of the iron out of the air. Jonas hauled an armload inside and nearly tripped over Caleb, who had found, surprise, something to test. Mr. Hale, Caleb said, not quite triumphant, lifting the corner of the rug with 2 guilty fingers. It's loose here. Jonas set the wood down. He studied the boy a beat too long. I said it stays shut. Caleb swallowed. What's in it? Tools, stores. Then it won't mind being looked at, Caleb muttered, already sliding the rug aside. Jonas's jaw worked. He could haul the boy back by the collar and make a point. But the peg at the gate, the print in the duff, and the boy by the door with the coal ember eyes argued for different priorities. He knelt and lifted the trap on its squealing hinge. The crawl space held what he'd said: hinges and a coffee can, a spare bridle, sacks of flour and beans against the coming snow. And in the back, where the dust lay thick, an oilskin-wrapped box the size of a Bible. Jonas hadn't looked at it in years. Caleb's breath hitched. Maggie hovered, holding her apron as if it could catch whatever fell out. Thomas stayed by the door, but his gaze slid to the box as if a string ran from his ribs to it. Jonas drew it out and set it on the floor. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. A pistol with a rust bloom along the barrel from a long-ago night in a town he never intended to see again, and a folded scrap of paper written in a hand not his. He undid the twine. The old smell rose. Oil, leather, the faint ghost of smoke. Maggie whispered, "What is it?" "Trouble," Jonas said and unfolded the paper. His name stared up at him from the page. Jonas, written by another man's hand, the letters dark, the tail of the S dragging as if the pen had wavered. Behind him, Thomas finally left the door. He came close enough to see, then stopped, eyes fixed on the ink as if it might burn. His lips moved, forming a word without sound. Then he looked up at Jonas and said very quietly, like someone returning a debt. You remember him now? The room seemed to tilt a degree. Outside, a branch gave up its snow with a thud. Jonas kept his eyes on the page because the boy's face was suddenly the harder thing to look at. Remember him, not it, not that night. Him. The pronoun put a shape to the shadow he'd been dodging for years. Back from the door, Jonas told Thomas, voice flat. Caleb, Maggie, step away from the trap. He didn't raise the pistol. He didn't need to. Whatever this was, it wouldn't be answered with a gun shoved into a boy's silence. From the yard came a sound too deliberate to be win. A board on the fence complaining under a new weight. Jonas's head snapped up. He slid the note into his pocket, set the box aside, and moved to the jamb. Thomas was already staring at the seam of light under the door, the corners of his mouth drawn tight, as if bracing for a word that would hurt to say. Jonas lifted the latch. The latch gave with a dull clack, and Jonas eased the door open just wide enough to let the barrel of cold air slip through. The yard lay hushed, snow crust brittle in the light of morning. Nothing stirred but the smoke trailing from his stovepipe. Yet the fence groaned again, faint, deliberate, not the wind. Jonas stepped outside, boots crunching, eyes narrowing to slits against the glare. Caleb and Maggie huddled at the doorway, peering out with wide eyes. Thomas stayed in the shadows, his face unreadable, though his gaze followed every move Jonas made. He circled the cabin slow, hand resting heavy on the pistol at his hip. The woodpile stood neat, the chicken coop still barred. Then he saw it, a boot print pressed deep into the snow by the fence, heel-worn crooked, narrow toe. The same track he and Thomas had noticed earlier. Whoever it was, he hadn't just passed by. He'd lingered, watched. Jonas crouched, fingers brushing the impression. The snow was fresh, not more than a few hours old. His gut clenched. A voice broke the silence behind him. Thomas, calm, steady. He's close. Jonas turned. The boy hadn't stepped outside, yet his words carried the certainty of a tracker who'd lived his whole life in the brush. Jonas's eyes met those ember-gray ones, and for a moment, it felt like the boy wasn't warning him. He was reminding him. He holstered the pistol, jaw tight. Back inside, he ordered. The children obeyed, though Caleb grumbled under his breath. Jonas shut the door hard, bolted it, and leaned against the frame, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. The oilskin box still sat open on the floor where he'd left it. Caleb stared at it with restless curiosity. Maggie clutched her doll to her chest, whispering a prayer. Thomas didn't move. He only kept his eyes fixed on Jonas. Jonas dragged a chair to the table and sat, the pistol resting in front of him. His voice cut low, dangerous. Boy, enough circles. You tell me plain. How do you know my name? Thomas stepped forward, the fire painting him in flickering light. He pointed at the folded paper Jonas had pocketed. Because of him, Jonas froze. The tavern night came back like a hammer. The fight, the blood, the man's last whisper of his name. The body left cooling on the plank floor. He'd buried that memory under years of silence. And yet here stood a child, not 10 years old, speaking as if he'd walked out of that very alley. Jonas's throat felt raw. That man's dead. Thomas's lips curved, not in mockery, but in something older, like truth wearing a child's face. Not to me. The cabin went still. The fire popped, spitting sparks that died quick in the air. Jonas felt the weight of the past clawing its way into the present, dragging shadows of blood across his floor. And outside, the fence creaked again. Longer this time. He knew then, whoever had left that boot print wasn't gone. Jonas stood, pistol in hand, every muscle taut as barbed wire. His voice was steady steel. Whoever's out there, they're coming back. Thomas's gaze didn't waver. They never left. Jonas kept the pistol low but ready, shoulders squared toward the door. The children clung to silence, breaths ragged in the dim firelight. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and iron, like a forge where truth was about to be hammered out. Stay back, Jonas said, eyes fixed on the shutter that rattled under the wind. But Thomas didn't move back. The pale boy stepped closer to the fire, its glow deepening the strange ember-gray of his eyes. He looked at Jonas as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. You know who I am, he said softly. Jonas's jaw tightened. You're a child, that's all you are. Thomas shook his head. No, you saw me before? The night you spilled blood. Jonas felt the words strike deep. He'd spent years trying to bury Wichita. The poker game gone bad. The fight that ended in a man's death. Yet the memory surfaced now with brutal clarity. That dying man's eyes, wide and wet with blood loss, had locked on him and whispered his name. Jonas swallowed hard, but when his gaze met Thomas's again, the world seemed to tilt. The boy's eyes were the same color, the same fire, the same unrelenting stare. He stumbled back, heart pounding. That's not possible. Caleb looked between them, fists clenched. What's he talking about? Jonas didn't answer. His chest heaved with something heavier than breath. Fear. Not of ghosts, but of the past, of choices that never stayed buried. Thomas stepped forward until he stood in the fire's glow, his shadow stretching long across the cabin floor. You remember his name, the man you left behind. The words cracked something in Jonas. His knuckles whitened around the pistol. He had lived in the mountains to escape men, mistakes, and memory. But this boy, this orphan he'd bought for $3, had dragged the past into his cabin and given it eyes, a voice, and a name he wasn't ready to hear. Before Jonas could speak, a long, deliberate creak split the air. The fence again, bending under a weight that was no wind. The girl gasped, clutching her doll tighter. Caleb reached for the hatchet by the woodpile. Jonas moved to the door, pulse hammering. He forced his voice steady. Whoever's out there, they've come for me. Thomas didn't flinch. His whisper cut sharper than any blade. No, Jonas. They've come for us all. The fire guttered, shadows leaping higher up the walls as if the cabin itself braced for what waited outside. Jonas pressed his back against the doorframe, pistol raised. The cabin had gone quiet enough to hear the children's hearts knocking through their ribs. Caleb clutched the hatchet, too big for his hand, but heavy enough to matter. Maggie buried her face in her doll's patched cloth. Thomas only stood in the firelight, still as a pine, his ember-gray eyes locked on the door. The sound came again, creak, wood complaining under weight, then silence. Jonas shifted the latch with slow care, then flung the door wide. The morning glare cut across the yard, snow burning white. For a moment, nothing. Just the fence, the pines, and the print of boots too fresh to ignore. Show yourself, Jonas barked, his voice carrying into the trees. The wind hushed. Then a figure detached itself from the shadows of the timberline. A tall man in a long coat, hat brim pulled low, walking slow, deliberate. His boots sank into the snow with the same crooked heel print Jonas had studied. Jonas's stomach nodded. That gait, he'd seen it once before. Years back in Wichita, when whiskey had blurred the edges of a card game and sharpened the edges of knives. The man he'd left bleeding on a tavern floor had walked like that, one leg dragging from an old break. But that man was dead. Jonas knew he was. The stranger stopped at the fence, resting one gloved hand on the rail. He lifted his head, and though the distance blurred his features, Jonas saw a scar split across the cheek. A scar he remembered giving. Caleb whispered, "Who is he?" Jonas didn't answer. Couldn't. His grip tightened on the pistol until the leather creaked. The man at the fence didn't call out, didn't reach for a gun. He only stood there watching. Then Thomas's voice, soft but cutting, filled the silence behind Jonas. I told you. He never left. Jonas's blood ran cold. The stranger tipped his hat, almost polite, then turned away, boots crunching as he walked back into the trees. The fence groaned once more, then stilled. Jonas lowered the pistol, chest heaving, though the air bit cold enough to steal breath. He shut the door and dropped the bar across it. The cabin walls suddenly felt thinner than paper. Caleb broke the silence. Why'd he look at you like that, like he knew you? Jonas didn't speak. He stared at the door as if the wood itself demanded answers. His past had not stayed buried. It had come to his fence, wearing scars he recognized. And the smallest boy, Thomas, watched him with the same knowing eyes, as if every step of that stranger had been written long before Jonas ever heard it. The cabin held its breath long after the stranger's boots had faded into the timber. Jonas kept his pistol on the table, eyes fixed on the door. The children shifted restlessly, the silence heavier than the mountains pressing in around them. Caleb was the first to break it. You know him. Not a question, an accusation. Jonas rubbed a hand over his jaw, rough stubble rasping like sandpaper. Eat your supper, he muttered. There ain't no supper, Caleb shot back. Just truth you're sitting on. Jonas's eyes flicked to the boy, and for a heartbeat, Caleb thought the man might strike him down with nothing but his stare. But Jonas only poured whiskey, hand trembling just enough to betray the storm in him. Maggie whispered, He looked mean, like he wanted to hurt us. Jonas shook his head. Not you, me. Thomas finally moved, stepping from the shadows into the fire's glow. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of something too old for his years. He already did. The words froze Jonas. Caleb frowned, confused. Maggie clutched her doll tighter. Jonas turned on Thomas, the weight of his own past heavy in his chest. Boy, enough riddles. You tell me plain. Who is that man to you? Thomas's ember-gray eyes reflected the fire, steady, unflinching. He's the one you left in the dirt, the one you thought was gone. Jonas's heart kicked like a startled horse. He saw it again. Wichita, the tavern, the knife, the blood pooling black on the floorboards. He remembered the man's last breath, whispering his name like a curse. But that man had died. Jonas had seen the light leave his eyes, and yet here was a boy, no more than 10, speaking with certainty, carrying the same eyes, the same fire, and a scarred figure waiting at his fence. Caleb slammed his palm on the table. You killed a man. Jonas's gaze snapped to him, hard as iron. That ain't a story for you. But Thomas's voice cut through, soft and sharp. It's not a story, it's the truth. And truths don't stay buried. The fire popped, sending sparks to the floor. Jonas gripped the pistol, though for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if it would protect him. Outside, the wind dragged long across the pines, carrying with it the faint sound of boots crunching snow, circling. The scarred man wasn't gone. He was waiting. The sound of boots circling the cabin gnawed at the walls like wolves testing a fence. Jonas rose slow, pistol gripped tight, his shadow stretching tall across the log walls. The firelight painted his face harsh, every scar a reminder that violence had never left him. It had only been waiting for its due. Get back from the windows, Jonas ordered. Caleb and Maggie obeyed, wide-eyed, clutching each other in the far corner. But Thomas remained where he was, standing straight as a fence post, his ember-gray eyes locked on Jonas. Jonas snapped, "Boy, move!" Thomas shook his head. You can't keep running from him. Jonas's teeth ground together. The boy's voice was too certain, too much like the man he'd buried in memory. He turned to the others. This ain't your fight. When the time comes, you stay down. You stay quiet. Caleb's voice cracked. But who is he? Why is he here? Jonas didn't answer. He couldn't. He only checked the chamber of his pistol, the click echoing like a verdict. Then came the knock. Slow, heavy, 3 times against the cabin door. Maggie whimpered. Caleb gripped the hatchet till his knuckles went white. Jonas stood rooted, gun raised, but his hand trembled just enough to betray him. He forced his voice out, low and steady. Name yourself. Silence. Then, through the door, a voice rasped like gravel under boots. You know my name, Jonas. The pistol nearly slipped from his grasp. The voice was older, ragged, but it was the same. The man from Wichita. The man who should have been dead. Thomas whispered, I told you, he never left. Jonas felt the weight of years crash down on him. He had built a cabin, a life, even bought children to fill the silence. But the past had ridden up the mountain and found him. The knock came again, harder this time. The bar across the door shuddered. Jonas steadied the pistol with both hands, breath burning in his lungs. If you want me, you'll get me. But you leave the children out of this. The voice outside laughed, low and bitter. Children don't wash away blood, Jonas. They carry it. The room spun. Jonas glanced at Thomas. The boy's eyes burned hotter, as if the stranger's words had given them fuel. Jonas realized with a sinking weight that this was more than a fight at his door. It was a reckoning, one that wouldn't end with bullets alone. If this story's gripped you so far, make sure to like and subscribe. The trail ahead only grows darker. The cabin shook as the bar rattled under another blow. Jonas braced his boots against the floor, pistol steady, every nerve screaming. Caleb clutched the hatchet like he meant to stand his ground. Maggie wept quiet into her doll, rocking with each thud. And Thomas only watched, his pale face lit by the fire, his ember-gray eyes glowing as if he'd already seen the end of this night. Stay back, Jonas warned the children. If that door breaks, I'll handle what comes through. The next knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a slam, splinters coughing from the frame. Jonas raised the pistol, but a voice stopped him cold. Jonas Hale, it rasped, dragging each syllable like a chain. Wichita wasn't the end. Jonas's finger froze on the trigger. His throat burned. I saw you die. A low laugh seeped through the wood. Part of me did. Thomas stepped closer to the fire. his voice calm but sharp as barbed wire. "He's not here for forgiveness. He's here for what you owe." Jonas spun on him. "What do you know of debts, boy?" Thomas's eyes didn't flinch. "Everything." Another slam cracked the wood. The doorframe buckled. Jonas cursed under his breath and dragged the children back. He shoved Caleb and Maggie toward the trapdoor. "Down, both of you." Caleb resisted. "I can fight." "Down," Jonas barked, voice hard as iron. The boy obeyed, pulling Maggie with him into the crawlspace. Jonas dropped the rug back in place, heart pounding. Only Thomas remained above ground, standing in the open, facing the door. Jonas grabbed his shoulder, but the boy didn't budge. "He won't touch them," Thomas said. "Not while you're here." Jonas's grip tightened. "And you?" Thomas looked up at him, a strange half-smile ghosting his lips. "I'm already touched." The door exploded inward, splinters flying. Smoke and cold rushed the cabin. Framed in the jagged break stood the scarred man, coat torn, eyes burning with the same cruel light Jonas had seen in Wichita. Jonas leveled the pistol, breath ragged. "It ends tonight." The man's smile was a scar stretched wide. "No, Jonas. Tonight it begins." Thomas whispered almost reverently, "Remember him." The fire roared high, throwing wild shadows across the cabin. As two paths, one man's guilt and one boy's secret, stood face to face with blood waiting to be spilled. The stranger stepped over the shattered door, boots grinding splinters into the floorboards. Snow swirled in behind him, a pale storm spilling into the cabin. His scar caught the firelight, twisting his face into something half man, half memory. Jonas kept his pistol leveled, though his arms shook from more than cold. His eyes darted once to Thomas, standing small but unflinching by the hearth. Caleb and Maggie lay silent beneath the trapdoor, the boards trembling with their fear. "You should have stayed dead," Jonas rasped. The man's laugh was low, bitter. "And you should have stayed honest. But blood don't forget." Thomas's voice cut through, steady as scripture. "He carries your name, Jonas. He always did." Jonas froze, the pistol dipped a fraction. "What do you mean?" The scarred man's smile spread thin. "He's the reason I crawled out of Wichita. Left to rot, I had nothing but one name to hang on to. Yours and then his." He jabbed a gloved finger at Thomas. Jonas's stomach turned to stone. The boy's eyes, the boy's voice, the way he whispered Jonas's name, it all snapped into place. "No," Jonas breathed. Thomas stepped forward, the fire painting him in shadow and light. "Yes, I am his blood, but I am yours too." The words struck harder than any bullet. Jonas staggered, pistol trembling. The tavern night came back in brutal clarity. The fight, the knife, the dying man's whisper. And now here stood the child left behind by that violence, wearing the dead man's eyes, speaking with the weight of two legacies. The scarred man's voice thundered. "The boy carries both debts, mine and yours. What'll you pay, Jonas?" Jonas's chest heaved, torn between rage and ruin. He could kill the man where he stood, and the threat, silence the past. But the boy's eyes held him fast. Violence had brought them all here. Another bullet wouldn't free them. Slowly, Jonas lowered the pistol. His voice broke like dry timber. "Then let it be me. My debt, not theirs. You want my blood? Take it." For the first time, the scarred man hesitated. His smile faltered, eyes flicking to Thomas. The boy's stare burned steady, unafraid. And in that silence, Jonas realized the truth. The past had not come to kill him. It had come to claim him. The scarred man stepped back into the snow. His voice drifted like smoke. "You'll see me again, Jonas Hale. In him. In time." Then he was gone, swallowed by the pines. The wind died. The fire sank low. Jonas stood hollow, pistol at his side, staring at the boy who carried two men's names inside him. Thomas whispered, almost tender, "Now you remember." The mountains held the echo, and Jonas knew there would be no